10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to the brief and bingeable true crime podcast, 10-Minute Murder. I'm Joe, the host. Thanks for being here today. And hey, what are your fingers doing right this minute? If you are not subscribed to this podcast, I know what your fingers should be doing, and that's clicking the subscribe button. Now, I know sometimes it says subscribe, and other times it says follow or collect. It just depends on where you're listening, but push that button, and in the future, you will not miss any episodes. You'll get them automatically. You don't have to go searching for this podcast every single week. And by the way, I try to release at least 2 episodes per week. So if you subscribe, you don't even have to go look for those. They'll automatically come to you. Also, if you are already a subscriber and there's a story that you have in mind that you think should be a part of 10-Minute Murder, you can email that to me, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. Or if it's easier and you follow 10-Minute Murder on social media, you can send me a direct message on there. The story today is of a lady that claimed she was carjacked. And in that attempted carjacking, they shot her children, who were in the back seat. It turns out her story was complete BS and so crazy that a book was written about it and also a made-for-TV movie. On May 19th, 1983, Diane Downs drove to the McKenzie-Willamette Hospital ER with her red Nissan sports car. Diane exited the vehicle yelling, "Someone killed my kids." On the back seat were her 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all shot at close range and covered in blood. 7-year-old Cheryl had already died. 8-year-old Christy had lost so much blood she had a stroke. And 3-year-old Danny was paralyzed as he had been shot straight into his spine. Diane, however, had been luckier. She had just a minor gunshot wound on her left arm. Diane told the officers who questioned her about what happened that a stranger had demanded her car on an unfamiliar back road where they had gone sightseeing that night. She refused to give up the car, and the shaggy-haired man began shooting. The problem was that Diane's story did not seem to add up. Why had she gone sightseeing with her young children in the dark? And why had she pulled over on an unfamiliar road for a creepy-looking guy waving for her to stop? Diane's behavior at the hospital was also very strange. According to hospital staff, including the surgeon who treated the children, Diane did not seem to be worried about her children at all. She never cried, and she sounded eerily calm and collected when questioned. Still, in the early 1980s, multiple serial killers and kidnappers were known to be active, and Diane's story caused panic among the locals. A manhunt for the bushy-haired man was launched, but as the search turned up nothing, investigators started to dig into Diane's life and history. Diane Downs was born Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, to Wesley Linden and Willadine Fredrickson. She rebelled against her parents and their conservative Baptist upbringing. At the age of 14, she began a relationship with a 16-year-old Stephen Downs, who she had met at Moon Valley High School. After graduation, Stephen joined the Navy, and Diane attended Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College. However, Diane was expelled for promiscuity after being in the school for only 1 year. She had to move back to her parents' house. Stephen and Diane continued their relationship even with the long distance in between them. In November 1973, when Stephen returned from the Navy, Diane ran away from home, and the two got married. From the beginning of the marriage, money problems and infidelities were a daily reason for fights. Stephen was suspicious that Diane was cheating, and she would often leave Stephen and go back to her parents' house. However, she would always go back. Despite their issues, the couple had their first daughter, Christy, in 1974, and a year later, they welcomed Cheryl Lynn, their second baby. According to Stephen, Diane was a rare sight when she was pregnant, as she always seemed to cheer up and really enjoy being pregnant. However, that quickly changed after the child was born. Stephen said Diane treated the kids like crap, and because of that, he didn't want to have any more children with her and had a vasectomy to make sure. Family moved to Mesa, Arizona in 1978, where Diane began working in a mobile home factory and had affairs with several of her co-workers, becoming pregnant again. In December 1979, Stephen Daniel was born. Stephen accepted Danny as his own, even though he knew he was not the boy's father. Still, marital problems became too much to handle, and in 1980, Stephen filed for divorce from Diane. The next few years, Diane spent bouncing from man to man, occasionally trying to reconcile with Stephen without success. Diane also attempted to become a surrogate mother to earn money, but she failed 2 psychiatric exams. One of the exams even indicated that Diane was psychotic, which she found extremely funny, and to her, it was something to brag about. In 1981, Diane began working as a postal carrier for the U.S. Post Office. The children stayed with her parents, Steve, and Danny's father in rotation, not really having a stable home. When the kids stayed with Diane, neighbors made reports that the children were not being cared for properly. For example, they said that the children were often without enough food, and in cold weather, they would not have the appropriate clothing. Diane would even sometimes leave 6-year-old Christy alone in charge of her younger siblings. Cheryl had mentioned she was afraid of her mother. And still, unbelievable as it sounds, Diane was eventually accepted into a surrogate program. She gave birth to another daughter on May 8, 1982, earning $10,000 for carrying a child and surrendering it to adoptive parents. Around this time, Diane also met a man she described as the man of her dreams, Robert Nick Knickerbocker. Robert was a married man and Diane's co-worker. The two were lovers for a few months until Diane, who was utterly obsessed with him, demanded that he divorce his wife. However, Robert chose his marriage, and he ended the intense and overwhelming affair with Diane. Diane wouldn't accept the relationship was over. She continued to write Robert every single day. It wasn't until April 1983, when the two met one last time, when Robert really broke it off, with him stating he wasn't interested in raising 3 children that were not his. Diane, who wasn't a good mother to begin with, started to view her own children as a burden. How convenient that just 1 month later, a stranger stopped Diane's car and shot her children. The investigators looking into Diane's background had just found the motive. After her children had been taken to the hospital in May 1983, Diane seemed detached from reality. She made statements like, "Boy, this really has spoiled my vacation," and "That ruined my new car. I got blood all over the back of it." So Diane was more concerned about her car than her own children and if they would survive. When police asked her to reenact what happened 4 days after her children were shot, Diane was making sure her hair and makeup looked good. She was also smiling and laughing, showing how the alleged killer had shot her children. About a month after the shooting, Diane gave several interviews stating how she had been through a horrible thing, completely forgetting her kids and not showing a single bit of sadness. Meanwhile, investigators found out that Diane had lied about not owning a gun. They had found .22 caliber casings at the crime scene, and even though Diane had told them she never had a gun, both Stephen and Robert told the police she owned a .22 Ruger pistol. In addition, .22 caliber bullets were later found in Diane's apartment, but still no weapon. Blood spatter patterns and gun residue powder on Diane's car also did not match her story. It looked very clear that the shaggy-haired man was just a made-up story. One of the most important pieces of evidence was Diane's own diary. On the pages, she had written about her obsession with Robert Knickerbocker. He would later tell the police that Diane had even stalked him and threatened to kill his wife to have him to herself. All of this, and the public's opinion, who had turned against Diane after the bizarre media appearances, caused massive pressure for the police to arrest her. But as there was not any physical evidence, they had to wait. There was one living witness to the crime, as Danny had been sleeping at the time, Christy Downs. She could be the key to crack the case, but the problem was after suffering a stroke, she had great difficulty speaking. It didn't sit right with the investigators that at one point, Diane had even asked the doctors to pull the plug since she knew Christy was brain dead, even though there was no evidence to support that claim. Diane's request was obviously denied, and later Christy went through intensive mental and physical therapy to regain her speech ability. Eventually, she was able to say who shot her. Diane was finally arrested on February 28, 1984. She was charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Her trial began in May. At the time, and most likely a way to gain more attention and sympathy, Diane was pregnant again. To a reporter, she said, quote, "I got pregnant because I miss Christy, I miss Danny, and I miss Cheryl so much." During the trial, Christy was able to take the stand and give testimony. What she answered to the question of who shot her shook the courtroom. My mom. In June, Diane Downs was found guilty on all 3 counts and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years in the Oregon Women's Correctional Center. Before her sentencing, Diane gave birth to her 4th daughter, Amy Elizabeth. In prison, Diane was diagnosed with narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. Diane's story should have ended here, but of course it didn't. Instead, on July 11, 1987, she escaped from prison over the 15-foot-high chain-link fence. For 10 days, she stayed with Wayne Seifer, a psychiatric aide who lived 4 blocks from the prison. She was later found in Wayne's home in the upstairs bedroom, wearing his t-shirts and boxer shorts. Wayne pleaded guilty to harboring Diane and was sentenced to 5 years probation and 6 months in a restitution center in Salem. Diane received an additional 5-year sentence for the escape and was transferred to the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. Danny and Christy were adopted by Fred Huge, who was the lead prosecutor in the case in 1986. And that's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. Thanks for listening today. And if you have a story idea that you'd like for me to possibly discuss, talk about, look into, research here on this podcast, send it to me, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. Or if you don't want to email and it's easier to send via direct message, you can do that if you follow 10 Minute Murder on Facebook and Instagram. I'll leave links for that in the show notes of this episode. Subscribe to this podcast if you have not done that already. And if you have any friends and they like weird things like we do, short stories about true crime, then let them know about 10 Minute Murder. Please and thank you. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.